Hey, John Gilroy here. In the next 30 minutes, you're going to learn everything you need to know about deep learning and cybersecurity. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. We have in the virtual studio today, direct from London, Carl Froggett, CEO of Deep Instinct. Round of applause, Carl. Let's hear some applause all the way from London. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good, John. Thank you so much.
Well, I've done so many interviews, and it's mandatory to talk about artificial intelligence. I can walk down to the 7-Eleven. I guarantee you they're talking about artificial intelligence in the parking lot. Everyone's talking about it, but like so many things, very few have any understanding about it. Very few have any deep understanding of what it is. So I thought I'd drag this guy, Carl, in, because if you look at his background on LinkedIn, he's been fighting the fights. He should have like scars on his forehead and being a sling and everything. He's been in the battles of some very important institutions. And so he has real good commercial experience. I thought we could bring his commercial experience in and help our leaders understand what artificial intelligence is, what machine learning is, and really what we talk about is deep learning. So before we begin, maybe you can give us a quick snapshot of this company called Deep Instinct. You can go to deepinstinct.com. I guess it started about 2015. Is that correct, Carl?
Yeah, it started several years ago with the co-founders and the culture and the mission of Deep Instinct is prevention first when it comes to threats. So yeah, we've been in a period now, for the last 10 years or so with machine learning based security, and we've all heard the phrase, detect and respond, right? EDR, and the co-founders really wanted to tilt back to a prevention first approach, right? Why detect and respond if we can prevent it first? And so that was the mantra and the mission of the company. They went to leverage deep learning, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit, John, and custom built the only deep learning framework for cybersecurity, even today, with that goal of a prevention first when it comes to threats and malware and ransomware. It took them 3 or 4 years to build the framework. They tried to use kind of off-the-shelf open source, and there were a lot of limitations when it came to cyber. So they were forced to, custom build, the deep learning framework for cyber. And since then, really building the rest of the software and the services to make it an enterprise kind of grade offering and platform that we can provide to some of the world's biggest brands and logos, which is what we do today.
I think what you position yourself as is in kind of like the perfect storm. You have a situation where attacks are increasing. And if we just look what happened with COVID, all kinds of endpoints came out of nowhere, all kinds of endpoints. And from maybe a cybersecurity perspective, there could be threat inherent in that. And I just think what's happening with the endpoints. And in fact, there's a podcast in town called Feds at the Edge. It's just dedicated to Feds at the Edge. And today the edge is on railroad tracks. It's on sensors in the ocean and up above us at 30,000 feet in LEO orbit. And so sensors are everywhere. And I think this is one problem that people expect what they expect. And what would Rumsfeld say? The unknown unknowns or something. So I think that's where you fit in, is the unknown unknowns where, this doesn't have a signature. Well, guess what? It can still hit you, can't it?
No, exactly, John. And I've spent almost 30 years in cyber. So I like to say it wasn't called cyber back when I started. It was called information security. And we didn't have a budget, and we certainly didn't have an energetic host like yourself doing podcasts. and let's be honest, John, seeing cyber in the media every day, right? There's always something every day, a breach, a new bad actor, ransomware attacks, right? So it is fulfilling to me as a old cyber professional, just seeing the acknowledgement of the challenges that we face. And you're spot on with devices. The way I like to think of those devices or endpoints is in my career was they were always the last resort, John. right? If you think about a device, a laptop or a server, for example, you have defense in depth, and and we should be thinking of defense in depth. But if you think of that endpoint, and you've got all these other layers of email protection for anti-phishing and firewalls, SSL inspection, all the different layers. So if something gets to your endpoint, that really means that one of those other layers failed, right? So I always kind of treated the endpoint as a last resort that I could control, right? And then obviously, as you mentioned, devices everywhere. So especially with businesses today, consumers, customers, which you have no control over their device, you don't know how hygienic they are. You got to protect yourself from the files and the data in motion, because that's generally how the threats get in, right? Is through email attachments, phishing, files, file uploads, right? That's how the malware gets into your environment in the first place, and it's a challenge.
I was at your website this morning, deepinstinct.com. I got a fantastic article here. I think everyone should read this. I'm going to put the link in the show notes here. It's called Significant Increase in Cybersecurity Attacks Fueled on Generative AI. What's going on here? I thought only the good guys have AI. Bad guys have AI? Carl, come on. You got to be kidding me.
I think like all things, John, there's tools that are put to good use, and then there's tools that are put not too much to good use, right? And I think for us, Deep Instinct being where we are in our journey, the whole Chat GPT really just was marketing machine for us, because that is exactly what we're fighting and preventing, at Deep Instinct at least, is the use of this powerful generative AI. And what does that mean? We've all read about bad actors, right? And they're constantly successful. And why is that? We've kind of got into this detect and respond. Now, bad actors use frameworks today. They have ransomware as a service, malware, right? They monetized it, and they've got a great business model. So now if they're able to leverage generative AI to build this malware and this threat, what that really means is, first, the increased sophistication, right? Second is every new variant of malware can really be unknown and unique. So we're used to historically, let's be honest, looking for patterns. Malware built by a particular framework generally has the same DNA, even if it looks a little bit different. And that's really how signatures and machine learning works today. But now we're going to be in a world, we're in a world where the malware is extremely sophisticated because it was built by a generative AI, and it's all unique. There will be, every single new malware that comes out will be a 0-day unique malware. And our current solutions are not very good at the unknown. And that's where deep learning and Deep Instinct come in.
I want to reinforce this article because I think it was a great article. And maybe people listening to this going, well, maybe old Ralph up in Minnesota, maybe he uses it. But no, this is prevalent. If you read this article, it's a survey. It says that 75% increase in attacks last year. I believe that. Yep. Listen to this. 85% attribute to bad actions using generative. So they're not only they're applying it, and people are getting scared, and so you have to fight fire with fire. I would assume the way to fight AI is with AI.
With AI. Yeah. No, and that's what we're doing, John. So with deep learning, it has some unique characteristics. So usually when I'm speaking to an audience for the very first time, I'm more focused on the outcomes that we have, right, rather than focusing on the tech. And the outcomes, what does deep learning mean? And I'm going to start this, John, with everything that we've believed for the last 10, 15 years is about to get turned on its head. So we have some things, for example, where we believe that we need to crowdsource information. And if you think of that, why do we need to do that? Because the machine learning or the signatures were never good enough on their own. Right? They all rely on a cloud analytics and a cloud intelligence sharing. So there's always a patient 0 and a patient 1, 2, 3 until all of that kicks in, and hopefully you get the updates, which can be, honestly, hours, days, or even weeks later, right? Deep learning pivots that on its head. Our biggest customers are not connected to the internet. So we don't need crowdsourcing, crowd sharing. We never take a customer's data or files. We don't need to, right? And these are characteristics of deep learning that are really, when I first initially talk to people, I have to ask them to, hey, this is an evolution. This is not a little step. So that I ask them to suspend what they believe they need and focus on the output of deep learning. And what it means, and deep learning is able to predictively prevent unknown malware that it has never, ever seen before. And we do demos where we take an old version of what we call the brain. That's the secret source, right? We take an old version and we run malware that was written today. And the old version of the brain will prevent the malware that was written today. And when I say old version of the brain, I mean months or a year old, right? A really old version. And yet we're still able to prevent malware written today, right, without any of that connectivity. This is just deep, the power of deep learning and the evolution that it is from what we have today, to bring prevention first, right, to stop it before it actually happens.
I talked to a lot of people over the decades here, and sometimes you talk about multi-factor authentication and system administrators, and they get sick of it. And there's just too many false problems. And so they let people in. And so what happens, they drop their guard. Just like in boxing, you drop your guard, you get clocked. And so what can happen is, okay, now you just say that, that happens. Now let's think this through. If the Department of Interior gets, let's say, 30,000 events in a day and 10% are false positive, I don't know, 1% are false positive, this means a human being has to jump and investigate it. And this is what you call money. This is a lot of expense. And so I think what a big selling point for your company's got to be this really elimination of false positives. And your website, you guys brag about it because I think you have a guarantee, don't you? I mean, this is impressive.
Yeah, no, we do, John. And there's a reason I spent 27 years at a large financial institution doing cyber. So there's a reason I'm at Deep Instinct, right? I tested it and actually I deployed it. And so, so the reason that we stand behind those numbers is really the fundamental difference between machine learning and deep learning. And because deep learning is so much more accurate on its own, that means obviously our efficacy rate, our prevention rate is 99.x, but it also means because we're more accurate that our false positive rate is really low. We have a customer doing around 4 billion files a month, and their false positive rate was, I can't remember, like 0.00, couple of mores, 2-3%, right? So really low. That's just the accuracy of deep learning and one of the characteristics of deep learning. And some of the other characteristics of deep learning is this is what I mean about suspending the belief of what we've learned about the detect and respond, right? Which was needed. Signatures were crumbling, they weren't working, they weren't able to scale, right? We had those frameworks I talked about that enabled mutation of malware, and signatures couldn't keep up. So the phase we've been in the last 10 years was a good step, but the bad guys, the threat landscape continues to change, right? They're using generative AI. They're going to continue to use generative AI because it's easy and it's cheap and it's very successful for creating a very sophisticated malware. But that deep learning that I talk about, and the brain, as we call it, that we can put on an endpoint, a server, or a laptop, you can consume the same deep learning brain through an API. So we integrate into applications and cloud storage. And we also just announced our DPS. So that's prevention for storage. So your Dell EMC and your NetApp storage. And this was a good area. Gartner highlighted the need this year to better protect the back-end storage, because ultimately your endpoints and your storage have access to data, and your applications, they're usually the ones processing and moving the files around. So between the agent and API and dedicated storage protection, we have a nice prevention platform that can plug into different layers of your defenses.
So, Carl, I've done a lot of interviews. In fact, you can go to federaltechpodcast.com and type in open source, and you see all kinds of interviews about open source. Many people I've interviewed think open source is the be all and end all to everything. Earlier in our conversation, you said, well, we start off in 2015 and then we start off with open source. And guess what? We had some problems with that. And maybe the problems had to do with scaling. I don't know what the problems with, but what happens is your company pivoted into being not only proprietary, but you have a registered patent on this. And so from your perspective is that, hey, open source could be well and good for other things, but for this particular application, you have to have proprietary ways to identify unstructured data. Is that correct?
Yeah, the restrictions were not necessarily on the open source itself. It was the characteristics of applying the different file types to threat and malware. So there were input layer kind of restrictions that we weren't able to get around, because one thing that I've learned, and I'm not a deep learning AI expert, we're fortunately like the blog post you're reading, we have a whole bunch of experts in threat and deep learning. But there were limitations, John. That's what it was, and it wasn't able to be overcome to apply the open, kind of frameworks to cyber, right? Which is why we had to do that. What I've learned is, it's not like Terminator, right? Like, it's not that the robots are going to take over. Deep learning is, you kind of have a framework that's very specific, I don't know, for delivering advertising, for example, and doing all that analytics, right? It's very specific to the area that you train, because obviously training these models to look for threats takes a lot of data. And again, we train our models on the same kind of sources of malware and whatever that others use, right? There's nothing kind of unique there. What is unique is deep learning is like you and I. So the more we train, the more, how can I put it, the more experience it has that it never forgets, right? So the more we train, the better it gets. And each subsequent release, the brain is, continuing to learn and evolve just like you and I.
Looked you up on LinkedIn. I saw you work for a very large financial institution. And does Deep Instinct, does have a unique advantage, an unfair advantage, especially with finances? Or so why was it a good match for a financial institution? Maybe, and every agency in the federal government's got finance to worry about.
Yeah, so in my previous role, very large, financial institution, 100 plus countries, over 800,000 endpoints, network devices, firewalls, and applications. So, I had, ultimately, every kind of variant of thing, CDR, sandboxes, web gateways, signature gateways. And there are various disadvantages to some of those approaches. And what that meant for my application teams, and these are very user experience sensitive applications, right? If you and I are using a website, say applying for a mortgage or whatever, then you don't want to see a spinny wheel, right? That's a bad user experience. And the matter of fact is, if I take sandboxes, they're slow. When you think of an application, the sandbox takes time. It's seconds. And actually, in one example, a real example, a sandbox took 22 minutes to analyze a file, right? Like you're not going to bring your custom to that website. You're probably going to go somewhere else. And so we had the challenges with that. We had obviously signatures were just failing in general. I think we've all agreed that as an industry now. And then with CDR, it interrupted business process because it would remove things and potentially break office automation or macros or whatever it is, right? That's the challenge, right? And so the problem was the user experience and the cost, because the application owners were looking for something that was fast, obviously. But the interesting thing, John, and this was the lesson I learned, was they wanted a reliability in the return. In other words, because of that user experience, they want to be able to say, Carl, return me a verdict in under 20 milliseconds, right? So that I know how my application is going to work. Because not all of these applications were user experience. Some of them were system to system. So again, this is why Deep Instinct was purchased and deployed to overcome the limitations of the existing kind of security technologies that we had, especially when it came to speed and the reliability of the verdict. Never mind the accuracy of did it detect, the ransomware and the malware. That was always variable. And one of the things, again, of deep learning, and we tested it for 2.5 to 3 years, was it's just constantly reliable when it was in the test, when we were testing in the lab. And it was just constantly 99.9 whatever, right? Very low false positive. And I would see, John, a fluctuation in the other technologies. In other words, their advocacy rate would go up and down. And when we did that analysis of why that is and why deep learning was up here, it's because the newer and unknown malware caused a drop in the efficacy rates of what I'll say machine learning based, right? It's not a particular vendor per se. It caused a drop, the newer or more unknown a malware was, but also a bigger drop was in how it was delivered, and especially around not executables, but Office documents and PDF, which is the lifeblood of any company these days. It was interesting to see the massive fluctuations in all those different solutions. So the newer and more unknown the malware combined with, kind of these more common Office PDF types cause these fluctuations that deep learning and deep instinct don't suffer with. And these were the reasons why we deployed.
One question, kind of a sensitive question. Many companies make statements that may not be accurate or maybe exaggerate certain things. Now, I went to your website, and the word, this is a strong word, the word was any device. And I said, any device or any device? Well, I don't know. So really, truly, Carl, is it any device? I mean, I know you focus on endpoints, but it's really that. It just seems it's almost unbelievable, to be that powerful.
And it is powerful. And as I've kind of mentioned, right, I had kind of 3 years of the experience of taking it and seeing the results. So my challenge there when I meet prospective customers is test it. Right?
Yeah.
Put us up against whoever. Any device, John, obviously, if I'm thinking of defense in depth and a good security architecture, obviously, yes, we support all the major operating systems and whatever. But you have things such as software distribution platforms or, IoT management right? So you have devices that you can't run an agent, right? So this is where I go back to the fact that when we're not just an endpoint agent, we have an API, we have an ICAP interface, and then we protect the storage. So with the API and the ICAP, you can insert us at many different points in management infrastructure, critical infrastructure, software distribution, right? File sharing mechanisms, data rooms. If it's got an API, we can do it, right? So this is where
apps,
about.
Huh?
Yep.
Even
absolutely.
When I think of protecting apps and storage and endpoints, it's like, okay, I mean, that's the big three. That's really what's going on.
And that's what we've been doing for the last and again, I've been involved with Deep Instinct for more than 3 years, and I've been here for 18 months now, right? So we were part of my team and others in my previous company, we were a design partner with these things, right? Because we could see the output, the efficacy, the accuracy, the speed, and the privacy, John, right? Because again, the deep learning never sends files or data to the cloud. We don't need to, right? And none of our solutions. So if I think of European GDPR, for example, very privacy sensitive, we don't have a cloud. Right. So everything I talked about that I did was always in my control, running in my data centers, or, it's container based. So you could run it in Amazon or wherever you want, but you're always in control of your data. Right. It never comes to us, and we have no need for it. And that, again, it's just another outcome of deep learning.
This has been a great interview. Opened me up to some things that I thought were almost impossible to achieve, but what can we go on places amazing.
Testers, John. I'm throwing the gauntlet down, man. Get us in. Testers.
You have been listening to Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Carl Froggett, CIO of Deep Instinct. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you so much, John. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.